show me a single self-respecting man that would like to climb into bed with that woman ever, who wasn't an incel, who wasn't a cucked little incel. That little woman has been fed, spoon-fed oppression. Who'd want to shag that?
That was Laurence Fox making his unfortunate comment on GB News recently. It's been suspended. There's been a lot of news coverage about it. And I've been following the coverage, and there are some things I think that need saying. I'd like to start off by agreeing with Laurence Fox that what he said there was out of order. The usual narrative is that it was sexist. I'm not sure it was sexist, but it was really horribly personal, degrading, sort of sexualized, dehumanizing, vulgar, completely out of order. I mean, outrageous. Now, when someone says something like that, was it just, it slipped out in the heat of the moment? Was it out of character for them? Or did it reveal their character? That's always an interesting question to ask, isn't it? I mean, a comment like that, is there any situation where you think you might make a comment like that? If you were on GB News being interviewed, might something like that slip out unawares, accidentally? Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I think sometimes you can have media personalities, alternative media and mainstream media, where they'll maybe restrain themselves in what they say, and you don't really get to see what sort of person they really are or what they really think. So that's an open question, isn't that? Was that a lapse by Laurence Fox, or was that a revelation of his true character? Discuss. Now, Laurence Fox has tried to make the excuse, this woman who was talking about she was really dismissive of men's mental health issues and suicide. So he was so wound up that it sort of came out that way. I don't buy that at all. I mean, I've seen what the journalist in question had said about men's mental health. She takes just a sort of standard feminist line. It's a battle of the sexes. So any concern relating to men, well, that's on the other side of the power struggle from the feminists, so they have to oppose it. So yeah, I completely disagree with what she was saying. But it wasn't in any way some sort of personally offensive comments that justified any sort of response like that. So no excuse. The other thing with cases like this, if someone's in hot water because they've said something bad, it's always very, very important to check up what they actually did say, in what context, because sometimes you'll find that what they said isn't actually what was reported. It's been misreported, mischaracterized. That's not the case here. I mean, it's pretty obvious what he said and obvious what's wrong with it. Now, Laurence Fox has apologised on Twitter, but when he was suspended by GB News, he immediately stabbed them in the back and absolutely slated them. So it's inevitable he's going to be fired. He's trying to present himself as a martyr, but really, GB News, as I say, it haven't really got much choice when your employee, first of all, behaves like that, but then completely stabs you in the back when you suspend it. I mean, he could have apologised behind the scenes, said, really sorry, it won't happen again, and then maybe they could have reinstated him. Maybe, I don't know. But I think that's not really a possibility, considering the way he's responded publicly. Now, with what he said there, it's been quite interesting that what's come out, I'm going to talk about this later as well, is it seems like an awful lot of people approach these issues not with a moral plumb line, what's right and wrong, what ought you to say and what ought you not to say. They don't come to it from that angle. They come to it from the point of view of which political tribe are they in. Laurence Fox is in my tribe, so therefore he's the goody. The people that criticise him, they're from a different political tribe, so they must be the baddies, so I'm on Laurence Fox's side. And this is really dangerous, and it's a growing trend in our society. We're going to talk about that a little bit further on. Right, GB News in this. GB News call themselves the home of free speech. I think what they mean by that is they plans to be a media outlet where a variety of opinions were welcome, a wider range of opinions than in the mainstream media. They wanted to be fairer in that regard. When they said they wanted to be the home of free speech, I don't think they were meaning that they wanted the morals to be in the gutter and all sorts of foul-mouthed abuse to be routine on their news channel. That wasn't what they meant by being the channel of free speech. Now, if they didn't want this sort of vulgar, obscene, offensive, abusive comments, then they need to judge the character of their presenters. And it may be they made a mistake in the case with Laurence Fox. But of course, the temptation is that the person who's edgy, who's the rudest and most mocking and scathing about their opponents, that's probably the way to chase ratings to some extent. But maybe GB News made a mistake in their balance of risk on that issue with Laurence Fox. So GB News suspended him because he wasn't representing what they want to be as a news channel. But there's more to it than that as well, because GB News is regulated by Ofcom, because they're a TV broadcaster and they've got no choice about that. So they have to conform to the standards that Ofcom will insist on as well. And basically Ofcom will not allow that sort of comment to be broadcast. So ultimately GB News haven't got any choice. They can't allow someone to speak like that. Now, we may think Ofcom do a good job or a bad job in various ways. That's a different topic. But it's just the fact this is not just GB News' decision. They're regulated as well. Now, some freedom of speech proponents, I've heard them commenting on this issue. I put something on Twitter for the family party saying what Laurence Fox said was really wrong. In other words, agreeing with Laurence Fox that what he said was really wrong. And you always get people coming back arguing, saying, I thought you were a freedom of speech party. How can you say you're for freedom of speech? And you're trying to explain that actually being freedom of speech, for freedom of speech, doesn't mean you think it's okay to be horrible, nasty and vulgar about people. But the people argue and argue with that, and they just say, oh, you're not a proper freedom of speech party. And you end up with the impression sometimes that some people argue for freedom of speech because they actually want to be horrible, nasty and vulgar themselves, or they want other people to be horrible, nasty and vulgar. And they present that under the banner of freedom of speech. That's not us at all. Now, freedom of speech is a complex issue. Now, often people don't like issues being complex. They like it to be very clear-cut, black and white. But freedom of speech, it isn't like that. There's different aspects to it. There's the law. For example, hate speech laws, we're completely against them. But there are legal restrictions on what you can say. There's also regulation, like Ofcom for a broadcaster, like professional regulatory bodies, etc. They have an impact on freedom of speech as well. And then there's things that are not legal or regulatory. It's just, an employer might decide to fire someone for certain reasons. It's not because of any regulation or law, that's their decision. And freedom of speech can affect people's views. Now, we think that's the main issue. You shouldn't face consequences for expressing unpopular, unfashionable viewpoints. If someone expresses hatred towards a person or a group of people, well, there might be some grounds for, say, an employer or a regulatory body taking some action. And also the way views are expressed can be valid as well in terms of what response is appropriate. Now, there's a big problem in Scotland with regard to freedom of speech. There's a problem with the law, the hate speech legislation coming in. There's a problem with regulation. I mean, look at me, almost 3 years of a GTCS, General Teaching Council for Scotland, case against me for saying children need a mum and a dad, ideally. And in terms of people's careers, lots of people live in fear, quite rightly, of what will happen to them if they express unfashionable views. So there are problems with freedom of speech in Scotland. On the other hand, that doesn't mean if someone writes all over social media, I hate black people, they should all go home. I'd like to be a teacher, please. Okay, it's perfectly reasonable for the General Teaching Council of Scotland to say, well, that's not acceptable. You can't be a teacher if you're expressing those views. It's not compatible. Or a police officer or whatever else. The problem in Scotland is that expressing perfectly reasonable views that are not hostile or hate-filled or in excessive language or whatever, they're just reasonable views, get classed as if they were saying you hate someone or this type of thing. So those who have reacted to the GB News thing, saying this is an example of cancel culture, well, it's not. It's not. Cancel culture is to do with people who hold the wrong views being banned from various activities, media, whatever. That's not what's happening here. It's not because of Laurence Fox's views. It's because of his sort of abusive, offensive comments towards this woman. Now, moving on with the story, we now come to Reverend Calvin Robertson. He's also a GB News presenter. He's a Christian. He's a minister, I think, of the Free Church of England. I'm not sure what that is. Generally with Calvin Robertson, I think he's done a good job. I struggle to think of anything I've heard him say that I disagree with. But in this case, he's sprung to the defence of Laurence Fox, claiming this is a freedom of speech issue. And he's also burnt his bridges with GB News by basically stabbing them in the back publicly about it. So I would guess he's made himself a martyr as well, or he's trying to, and he'll probably be fired by GB News as well. And it's been fascinating seeing the response, particularly from people who I assume are Christians, who are like quoting Bible verses to him, telling him to stand up and be strong as he faces persecution for the faith as he stands up for what he believes in. Wow, what is going on here? I mean, here's a tweet that Calvin Robertson put out, well, his main tweet in response to the issue. He said, "No one is naive enough to believe this is about Lawrence's crass language." That's what he means there. It's not to do with Laurence Fox being abusive and offensive. It's all a conspiracy against GB News. It's really just people who want to shut GB News down. Now, there are people who'd like to shut GB News down, and I think that's terrible. People shouldn't think like that. People shouldn't think, I don't like the viewpoint of this news channel, so it should be shut down. That's terrible. But is that the main thing behind it? No. I mean, the GB News itself didn't suspend him because they want to shut GB News down. They suspended him because they want to maintain GB News' reputation and the ethos that it's trying to convey to its audience. So to suggest it's all part of a big conspiracy is nonsense. It is about what Laurence Fox said. And what he said was outrageous. It was beyond the pale. Right, so Calvin Robertson goes on. That is his style. GB News knew that when they hired him. Viewers know that when they choose to tune in or not. That's democracy in action. They did know that when they hired him. I've made that point already. Maybe they made a mistake. I'm sure they made their standards clear to him, but he deviated from them on this occasion. Viewers know that when they choose to tune in or not. Well, do they know that? I suggest they don't. They didn't expect that because that's why there's been all this outrage. That's why GB News has suspended him, because he said something that was very much out of character with the usual output of the channel. I mean, that's democracy in action. Don't really follow that. I think in terms of regulation as well, I'm quite happy that Ofcom will say that certain types of sort of grossly offensive and insulting content can't be broadcast on television. I'm actually happy with that. I think that's good. Okay. Right, there is an appropriate way to have a conversation about standards. However, rather than speaking to him privately, they've chosen to distance themselves by virtue signalling, and in doing so, they have thrown fuel on the fire. So what Calvin Robertson's saying is GB News should have taken Laurence Fox quietly to one side and said, what you said there was a bit out of order, so if you could try not to say that in future, that'd be great. And if Laurence said, okay, yeah, no problem, I'll try my best, and that should have been it. But that's nonsense. If there's an issue within your employment, if you deviate from your guidelines, if you do something you're not supposed to do, then it depends on the seriousness. If it's pretty low level, you might have a little friendly chat about it. But there's always going to be some things that will lead to instant dismissal or suspension while it's investigated. That's always going to be the way. So it's saying GB News are virtue signalling by suspending someone for making a grossly offensive and vulgar comment. That's virtue signalling. I mean, what are you thinking, Calvin? How's this coming from your Christian faith here? I'm struggling with this. Right, he goes on to say, the woke mob, I'm not sure that's very helpful, but anyway, the woke mob is circling the waters, and these guys are giving them the scent of fresh blood. It's short-sighted. You cannot appease the woke mob. Have they not learned this yet? Well, again, see what he's doing there? It's tribalism. He's trying to say they're the baddies, the people out there criticising, and Laurence Fox is a goodie because we're the sort of anti-woke ones. So it doesn't matter what's right and wrong. It matters which tribe you're in. So I'm in the tribe with Laurence Fox, so what he says is good. And the people who are complaining about his sort of vulgar, grossly offensive comments, well, that's just the woke mob. So we need to ignore those. Now, these people are attacking GB News. What they want to do, they want to portray GB News as immoral, a bad news service where bad people say bad things. And GB News don't want to be that, don't want to be seen like that. But Calvin Robertson seems to be determined that they are seen like that. In other words, to give ammunition to GB News' critics. That's what that would amount to. Anyway, Calvin goes on. Either you stand up for something or you do not stand at all. Again, very high principled language, isn't it? If you don't stand up for the right of someone to be absolutely grossly offensive to a woman, then you stand for nothing. What is he on about? The home of free speech, no, not that speech. Unless GB News, and that includes its management, presenters and producers, stands for free speech, there's no point in its existence. So if GB News doesn't allow us a grossly offensive and vulgar comment, there's no point in its existing. Thank you, Reverend Robinson, for your perspective, but I really do not know what you're talking about. Because what's happened here with Calvin Robertson seems to be what's happened with a lot of other people I'm seeing on social media responding to this, is tribalism has overwhelmed morality. I hope he comes to his senses and reflects on this and realises he's making a mistake here. So like Laurence Fox, is he a good character? Is he of good character? I think to a lot of people, they don't care. He's on our side, he's in our tribe, he winds up the woke, so yeah, I don't care what sort of person he is. He's on our side, so I'm on his side. That's not a good attitude. So what's Laurence Fox done? What now is suspended. I mean, straight away he's been on Andrew Tate's live stream, having a chat with Andrew Tate. Now, Andrew Tate is a reprehensible crook who's made a lot of his money by getting girls to perform sort of sexual shows on live streams for men who will pay. Certainly, personally, he treats women as sex objects. But for some people, he's an anti-feminist. So he's in our tribe, so we're on his side. We're on his side. And people do all sorts of gymnastics and mental contortions to delude themselves that someone like Andrew Tate is really okay. And the same is happening with Laurence Fox and his comments here. I don't know much about Laurence Fox more broadly, but his comments he made, they were just downright wrong. But people are going to all sorts of lengths to try and bend the facts to make it fit their tribal allegiance. So that's my conclusion here. What comes first for you? What's most important? Your political tribe or your moral plumb line? And I'm sure your answer is going to be the moral plumb line. To be honest, if your first allegiance was to a political tribe, you probably wouldn't be watching this. You'd be watching something else on YouTube. So I would imagine virtually all of you watching would say, yeah, what's right and wrong comes first. Your sort of tribal identity comes second. But as we live in a more and more polarized society, more and more people see their political tribal loyalty as more important than morality. Tribal identity first, then moral judgment has to bend to fit the tribe's narrative. I think that's extremely, extremely dangerous. And you will never find that happening with the Scottish Family Party. So I would encourage you to join us. There's a link below. And come to our conference in Glasgow, Saturday the 11th of November. It's just in the afternoon, just outside the central Glasgow. We would love to see you there. Again, there's a link below. Thanks for watching.